Hi everyone, welcome to Weird Catastrophe. Today I'm going to be sharing an interview that I did with Jack Mitchell. He is the first producer of the NPR show All Things Considered. And in fact, he was one of the first, if not the first, employees of NPR since its inception. And I interviewed him because I am currently writing an article critiquing NPR's news coverage and analysis. And I reached out to Dr. Mitchell because I saw that he had authored a book about the history of American public radio and NPR, and writing about his time working at NPR, and then also giving some thoughtful consideration to the various critiques that NPR gets from both the left and the right. And I wanted to get his sort of insider perspective to help flesh out that piece that I'm currently working on. I think that he provided some very valuable perspectives about how NPR has changed since it first started back in the 70s, and was able to give some thoughtful consideration to how NPR could improve its current programming. I was very glad that Dr. Mitchell was able to and willing to chat for a bit, and I hope you enjoy the interview. You were one of the first employees and the first producer of All Things Considered at NPR.
That's right.
What is your view of kind of the average NPR radio listener, public radio listener? Who do you think tends to engage with their content?
Sure. Yeah. Well, we know various, they take ratings and they do a lot of research, so they know exactly who it is. And the answer are people who are highly educated. That's the key. The more education you have, the more likely you are to listen. If you did not graduate from high school, you do not listen, period. And if you have a master's or a PhD, you're almost certainly listen. So that's the determination.
And do you currently work with Wisconsin Public Radio?
No, I left there about 20 years ago. So I'm not with it anymore. I went into teaching. And so I left in 1997, I think it was. So it's over 20 years since I was there. I still stay in touch. Mm-hmm. And I know, well, most of the people I knew left, have gone by now, but I just still know a few of the people there now.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But I'm not involved at all. And I know I've had no contact with NPR whatsoever in at least 25 years or so.
Okay. You've written about and talked about before a kind of crisis that happened at NPR around 1976, where there were disagreements over the direction that NPR would go. Can you kind of explain that and what happened?
Sure. Yeah, that was very important. We had the founding philosophy of NPR was written by a guy named Bill Siemering. It's called the NPR Purposes. And it's highly romantic in the sense that a world-changing kind of view, very inclusive. It was to be hearing from people, the real people, not the experts. It was to be highly diverse in the sense of people of all sorts there, many accents, we wanted Southern accents, urban accents, etc. And it was to be representative of the entire country. The assumption was that all kinds of people would listen to this because all kinds of people were represented. That was not realistic. No radio service serves everybody. And in fact, although we had a variety of people working there, some minority, certainly from different parts of the country, what they all had in common was education. They were all at least college graduates, and most of them were not only college graduates, but like college. They were academic, intellectual kind of people.
Mm-hmm.
And so the staff really, although some with some diversity in demographics, et cetera, not really in terms of outlook. And so it was an elite group. And it produced programming that appealed to people similar to the folks that worked there. It was quite a bit younger than it is now. Our average age was something like 40 in terms of listeners. Now it's up around 60. Mm-hmm. But the staff was very young, and it was this. Remember, this is 1960. What was it? 68, 69, 70, early 70s. Well, throughout the 70s. This was Vietnam. This was civil rights movement. It was a lot of radical stuff. Richard Nixon was president. We all hated Richard Nixon. It was, it was just kind of a youngish radical, not radical in this. Progressive might be the better way to put it. Radical is too strong, but it's like your academic grad students. Mm-hmm. That's what the staff was, and the audience became more or less like the folks who were producing the stuff.
Mm-hmm. And then,
in fact, the '76 crisis was the folks that were working. Many of the people that worked there were journalists, came from a journalistic background or had journalistic views of what we ought to be doing. And they wanted to be a respectable journalistic organization. We were right across the street from the CBS office. We were at 2025. They were at 20. Yeah, we were 2025M and they were 2020M, right across the street. And Eric Severide and Dan Rather and all those folks were coming in and out all the time across the street. And we go to a restaurant and who's at the next table, but Eric Severide. And it was just that and the folks kind of wanted to become part of that. A lot of them applied for jobs at CBS. Some got them, most of them didn't. Mm-hmm. But the aspirations of the staff were to become respectable, And so we had this conflict between the ideal that had been laid out by Siemering, which, as I say, was never terribly realistic. And then the desire of many of the staff people to be mainstream. And that conflict came to a head in '76 when the management hired some outside consultants to come in and look at the place. And they said, well, look, here's your mission statement, and here's what you're doing. They don't match. And that what it resulted in was that I left, many others left, including the president, the vice president. The whole top management was kicked out. And the stations brought in Frank Mankiewicz, who was a liberal Democrat journalist who said he didn't even care about any of that Siemering stuff. He just wanted to be the best journalistic organization it could be. And as a result, NPR never quite lost the original concept, but it became overwhelmingly a very good mainstream operation. Whereas Siemering has said, why do we always have to start, all things considered, with what happened at the White House today? Maybe somebody got a job in Philadelphia, and that's a big deal for that person. Why don't we lead with that? Mm-hmm. So it was a totally different. Siemering was not a journalist; it was a philosopher, a dreamer. Really, wonderful human being, but not much of a journalist.
Mm-hmm. Since then, the only NPR that I've ever known has been that kind of more mainstream,
absolutely
professionalized outlet.
You bet.
You talk about in your book the critiques from both the right and the left that NPR gets, and there is this critique that as NPR has kind of gone away from its original mission, and part of that original mission was to have it be funded by mostly by the taxpayer, by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Right.
And it has since shifted to relying on corporate sponsorships and the model of public radio stations paying for syndication for the NPR programming.
Right. Yeah, and members, listeners, supporting the stations. And that's really, to my mind, the driving force is that public radio found out it had a very elite, good audience and a rather well fixed, really comfortable audience who would be willing to pay for it. And then they could get underwriters, advertisers, if you want to call it that, who wanted to reach these people. And you didn't reach them by advertising on Friends on TV. You had to get to them from at a lower cost at NPR. So what we called it at that time, audience-driven income. The audience contributes the biggest part of it, and then you have advertisers who want to reach those people. And that became the holy grail of build the audience of that kind of person, and you will not need the federal money. And frankly, public radio does not need the federal money it gets, in my opinion. It's partly because we've found a more lucrative way to do things. And secondly, because the federal government never really came through with what was promised. This was part of the Great Society under Lyndon Johnson. And it was to be, Lyndon Johnson was spending money on all kinds of fine things. In my opinion, they were good things. And not the Vietnam War, but all the rest of it. And then when Nixon came in, succeeded him, he didn't want to be funding this thing at all. And as a result, the promised money never came. And in fact, he was trying to eliminate it at one point, but they never quite eliminated it, but they kept it low. And so as a result, if NPR or PBS, for that matter, were going to meet their potential, they had to find other income. And it was viewers and listeners. In the case of radio, they're overwhelmingly listeners. And then PBS was more, big corporate underwriters of programs. And the thing about public radio that makes it different from TV on this count is that essentially public radio is selling its audience to lots of people who want to reach that audience. Public television is much more of underwriting a specific program. So Mobile Oil pays for Masterpiece Theater. So it's program by program funding, whereas public radio has very little program underwriting where a particular sponsor pays for a particular program. Rather, they just pay a small amount to reach the audience. You have lots of different ones, and no one is responsible for any area of content. And that's really important to people in public radio, that if any underwriter wants to drop out, they'll be replaced by somebody else who wants to reach that audience. So it's not, when you said corporate support, and that's appropriate, an appropriate phrase, but it's, in the case of public TV, traditionally, oil companies and other General Motors, whatever, sponsor a particular program. And in the case of radio, it's run of station, which you call it, where you don't sponsor any particular program. You just throw money into the pot and you get your name mentioned so many times during the course of a week.
And do you see a connection between the kind of mainstream quality of NPR's news coverage being able to garner those corporate sponsorships?
Sure.
or is it just a matter of NPR was able to develop an audience of millions of people, and therefore that's where the audience is, that's where the sponsorships will want to be put? Or you see what I mean? Is like,
yeah, it's the latter. That it's you have a NPR has accumulated a very desirable audience, and advertisers want to reach them. Mm-hmm. I don't think the advertisers want to influence content. They don't care about the content, mm-hmm. And if that audience were listening to reggae music, they'd sponsor that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's some people critiquing NPR's coverage on the left who would say, well, even if NPR had this level of audience that they do, they probably wouldn't be able to garner certain corporate sponsorships if they were more mm-hmm. Anti-corporate, anti-capitalist, adversarial in that sense.
Yeah, I know that argument, and I don't really think that's right. I have many things I'd criticize NPR for, but I don't really think that's it. I think Coca-Cola doesn't underwrite NPR because Coca-Cola drinkers, you can reach a lot more of them, elsewhere. Mm-hmm. It's really people who want to reach that particular audience, I think, who do it, and I don't think they really care much about the content. Mm-hmm. And in my experience, and granted, I haven't been involved for 25 years, but we never that was never an issue. It wasn't that some underwriter says, don't do this, or we want you to do that. It just never happened. And that goes for government too, as far as that goes. We never got, the Nixon administration tried, but after Nixon was done, I'm not aware of any governmental attempt. Some congressmen blow off their, they shoot off their mouths about these things, but they don't really do anything. So the key of why NPR is the way it is I think that the audience, they know how to serve a particularly desirable audience. Mm-hmm. And they want to do that, and will continue to do that.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a bit about the actual content and quality of NPR's coverage. You said that there's some things that you would critique about them currently, and you talked about the kind of professionalization of NPR that happened. Mm-hmm. People on the left, such as Ralph Nader, say that the coverage of NPR doesn't focus on the kind of corporate control of and privatization of public services, and they focus more on like what's in the news, like what you said, what's happening at the White House, as opposed to perhaps still important issues, but not what's in like the current news cycle. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, fundamentally, going back to the politics of the audience and the politics of the staff, which tend to be the same. Socially very liberal. I mean, they were sympathetic toward gay rights 30 years ago, before it was fashionable. Women's rights, Black Lives Matter. This is all stuff that resonates with the socially liberal, college-educated people who who make up much of the Democratic Party, and who are in fact, make up much of the public radio audience. There is not as much interest in major economic reform among those audiences. I mean, they're doing pretty well themselves. They probably own stock in companies, and they're not, or if they're not directly through their pension funds or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not revolutionary economically. I mean, I don't think very many public radio listeners or staff really want to break up General Motors. Not that that's a big deal anymore, but let's see break up Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's just there's not an economic liberalism that goes along quite with social liberalism. And that's true. I'd say the mainstream Democratic Party. Elizabeth Warren is an exception, but is not involved and doesn't have those kind of policies. The New York Times doesn't really reflect that kind of attitude. I don't know that it's because the corporations are sponsoring it. It's that the comfortable audience doesn't want to become economically uncomfortable. It's just not something that burns in their souls that, what are we going to do about economic reform, corporate reform, antitrust? Who talks about that anymore? It's, well, maybe a little bit, not much. And it's not part of the mainstream liberal, I say moderately liberal or center right, center left kind of thing. Public radio was never radical. New York Times was never radical. Mainstream media are not radical. The public is not radical. So I think that's, and if you're trying to serve the public or give the public what interests them, you're not going to make them uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's this idea that NPR, especially compared to other outlets such as CNN, the commercial outlets that have really gone down this path of cornering certain demographics and political ideologies and having their own base that is pretty unapologetically partisan. And there seems to be a view that NPR is more grounded and level and doesn't really go down that path of trying to amp up their audience, as it were.
Right.
And so there's these notions of fair and balanced that NPR adheres to. But you're talking about how the kind of liberal, well-educated ideology of their listeners and their staff nevertheless has an influence on how they cover things. And do you think that those notions of fair and balanced have any kind of meaning at NPR? Like what does that mean?
Well, that's a good question. What does that mean? I was going to throw right back to you. Because you can be fair. I guess I don't even think much in those terms. It's a matter of what interests you. What do you think is important? Mm-hmm. And what do the journalists think is important? And what does your audience think is important? And it tends to be the same. So I think that NPR does a fair and balanced job of covering the topics it covers. But does it cover every topic? No. But when it covers something, I think it's pretty good. It's liberal, no question. And I think, but most listeners who listen to it don't perceive that because they're liberal too. That seems right, So I don't know that we have much of a, there's not a perception, but of it, particularly among those who listen. They think it's great. But I think if you look at it more objectively, I think you see that it covers I'll just put it covers what interests liberals in a reasonably fair and balanced way. But it doesn't cover what interests right wingers. No, it doesn't take their concerns real seriously. And if it does cover them, it's from a negative point of view.
And I heard you say elsewhere that in NPR's early days, in its early iterations, you guys were pretty, you said you were all opposed to the Vietnam War, and you all hated Nixon.
Yep.
And you saw yourselves not so much as just covering the war, but kind of discussing and arguing against the war.
Right. That's right. Or just ideally covering both sides of the argument. But this was something that I felt pretty strongly about when I was producing ATC, is that we were not sending another correspondent to some place. No point in sending another correspondent to the Soviet invasion. That's. In that case, if I send somebody to cover a White House press conference or the press conference in Saigon, it's just because that's being covered. And what was really required, and what I continue to believe, is debate. Let's argue about the two, what should be done. What are the various courses of action? And with people who sincerely believe in whatever course of action you're talking about, discussing it. And out of this may be coming just more disagreement, but maybe some compromise, or at least clarity about what the arguments are. And that was always what I believed in when I was producing the show. And I still believe it. And there's some discussion now at WPR, Wisconsin Public Radio, about changing a number of things in the service. And that's my big argument. Look, come on, let's have the old fairness doctrine, which was probably before your time, said radio stations or TV stations are required to present contrasting points of view on issues of public importance. That was the phrase of the fairness doctrine, which was gotten rid of under Reagan. But that, I still believe in that, and that it's the discussion of what ought to be done is what we should be talking about, as opposed to here's what somebody is saying, here's what happened, this kind of stuff. Okay, somebody has to do that, and that's fine. But everybody does that. CNN does a great job with that, but there should be a place where alternatives are discussed. And their debate, contrasting points of view. And we tend not to get that on public radio as much as I would think it should. In Wisconsin Public Radio, not at all. This is why it's kind of fresh in my mind now. But this goes right back to my ATC days, that we ought to take the crazy Republicans seriously and discuss what they are proposing. It's probably nutty, but we ought to let them say what they want to say, have other people say that they're crazy, and go from there. And similarly, the liberal ideological assumptions ought to be challenged. How much do Black Lives matter? Well, I don't know. Do they matter more than anybody else? These are things that we don't talk about. It's just not discussed. Whether the assumptions that we make are not challenged. And I think you're not going to particularly change my mind about whether Black Lives matter. But somebody ought to say they don't, or they don't matter any more than anybody else. Somebody ought to say that. And you don't hear that on public radio or anywhere else, frankly. It's people, they just say their predictable things without real clash of opinions. And I think that's discussion. it's in this sense that, I'm basically an overly educated university person, just like most of the staff. But universities should be about debating ideas. And real debate doesn't happen on public radio, and I wish it would.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, this is kind of a separate topic from just NPR, but just in terms of the academy, like you said, a lot of people who are at NPR are very well educated. That's who their listeners are. What is your view of the kind of influence that academic studies have on the world of journalism, specifically, being that that's where a lot of professionalized journalists come from,
Yep.
including at NPR? What do you see that influence being?
Well, NPR takes the academic world seriously, as does the New York Times. The New York Times, when I make that analogy, the New York Times audience is essentially the same as the NPR audience. And and when you go to a university, there's always a stack of, there used to be stacks of the New York Times,
Mm-hmm.
at the student union, because the faculty had to get their copy, and grad students, and it was true when I was there. Now it's all online, but in those days we had papers, and NPR and the New York Times is better than NPR, but actually covering what some of the things are going on in the academic world. What the study, a new study comes out and says that men are more obnoxious than women, or whatever the thing is. And we'll cover it. Public radio covers it. The New York Times covers it. Fox News will get mad about it, but NPR and New York Times will cover it pretty straight. Whether I think what does not come across is the notion of real discussion about these things. Okay, so this new study comes out from some sociology department. It tells you something, but and if it's kind of a liberal kind of thing, which most of that study stuff is, we report that. But do we really debate it? Okay, are there other academics who say, no, this is crazy, or my data is different, so we tend to take it at face value. Mm-hmm. That, okay, these people are the experts, they studied it, here's their report. And as opposed to discussing what were their assumptions, and really questioning it. Now, that's fine in a seminar. Whether it works as a radio program, I'm not as sure, but mm-hmm. I think that's a discussion. That's what I'm going at. And NPR takes the academic world seriously, yeah, but not questioning it really.
Yeah. And back when you were at NPR, did you guys have callers come on for any of your news coverage?
No. Well, this was one of the big arguments that in the early days, the mainstream view at NPR was that we do not want telephones. In fact, the engineers they built this elaborate, beautiful studios, which were incapable of using telephones. Mm. You couldn't do a telephone interview. But we had, when I became producer of ATC, we said that's got to change. We did not take phone calls from random listeners, but we did call outs where we'd find somebody and call them. And in fact, in the early days when Susan Stamberg was hosting and I was producing, we had people around the country who were kind of our observers. There was a guy named Charlie in Kansas, and Charlie was he's a farmer, but a very thoughtful guy. And we used to call him every month or so and see what's going on. And we had a woman in Wisconsin, I forgot what her name was, but she's a housewife. She she just took care of the house like most women did at that time.
Mm-hmm.
But once again, a very thoughtful person. And so we had these people, the real voices. And at one proud moment, there was a strike going on in Lordstown, Ohio, at the Chevrolet plant there.
Mm-hmm.
And what are we going to do? Should we, how are we going to cover that? So we got the phone number of the telephone booth, in the lunchroom at Lordstown. We called it, and whoever answered the phone, we talked to them. So we did a lot of that. I and Susan was really important, very influential in the anti-hard news approach. So we were trying to get more ordinary people on, and so we did that. But we did not do call-ins per se. And so they got to it for a while, but they don't want that. They want authoritative journalists.
Right. And do you think how is there a way for NPR specifically, but I guess more generally, American Public Radio, to regain any of that, as what you just described, that kind of soul of public radio, to have that kind of scrappy iteration, or is it something that's just far too entrenched and mainstream as it is now?
Yeah, it was very good. Very big challenge. I would love to see more of it. I don't think NPR could possibly change. It's become so big and so bureaucratic and so ingrown that I just don't think it could change much. Mm-hmm. And the stations pretty much ape NPR. Now, when I left WP Wisconsin Public Radio about 20 years ago. So it's gone far beyond my influences, is waning, shall we say. And but we did start a call-in, we had a separate network. We got a second network built. We called it the Ideas Network, which was to be the kind of thing I've been talking about, with lots of discussion and calls and what have you. And the subsequent people who came after me really didn't believe in that stuff. They didn't quite get rid of it, but they didn't believe in it. And so they were screening the calls, and let's not have so many. And it became sterile. They tried to make it as sterile as NPR. And I'm very sorry to see that, but that's kind of a lost cause. And so they're going to be doing some restructuring, and I'm trying to get them to do at least revive some of that. But I don't, they don't have to listen to me. Mm-hmm. They should. But
yeah, and
they need a new organization. I think that, Pacifica might have done that, but they're so screwed up in their own way that I don't think they could manage to really get something coherent like that together. Uh-huh. But there must be other organizations that could. But right now, the world is so fragmented, the media world, that it's almost impossible to have a place that's encompassing more than just a very narrow audience. Mm-hmm. I'm one of like something that's broader, that reaches a variety of people where they talk to each other. And that's, and it's not just the NPR's problem, it's the whole media thing. And now with podcasts and all that, you can really reinforce whatever it is you're interested in, and without ever any contrary point of view. Right. And I think that, I don't know whether it's possible for anybody to do that. Maybe Oprah could on TV. She might be able to do it, but there aren't very many.
Yeah. as we were talking about before, that's kind of been the model of commercial outlets, of really siloing off particular demographics of people. And there is value to me for an outlet such as the New York Times or NPR that does have a very broad, influential readership and listener audience, for that kind of mainstream, professionalized, put together journalism. But I think it does leave a lot out, especially just in terms of tone, not even just what's covered and what isn't covered, but that tone, it's that very even keel kind of thing.
Linda Wertheimer.
Yeah,
I've heard that was not my original, but someplace I wrote about the influences of, I don't think of the Linda Wertheimerization of public radio, because Susan Sandberg, who was before your time, she was lively, and she was New York, she was Bronx, she was raised in the Bronx, and she sounded like it, and she was kind of brassy, and she laughed on the air, and that Linda, who was a close friend of hers, became host. And it just became flat, neutral. And that is the basic tone of everybody now. Occasionally, Robert Krulwich, he's, a human being. And Scott Simon is sort of a human being. But mostly they're not.
I guess just one more general question about the current state of NPR's quality of coverage. Do you think that there is anything, because a lot of people will get most of their news from just one or two outlets?
Absolutely.
And what, if you can kind of put a summation on what is a listener of NPR, what is a reader of the New York Times missing out on if those are their sole news sources?
Yeah. Well, they don't understand all the people that don't listen to the NPR or the New York Times. They really don't have much respect for anybody who voted for Donald Trump. Well, half the country did. And I think that's a huge, that's a pretty big blind spot if you're trying to work in a democracy and want a functioning society. You really do have to not only understand, but respect. I guess that's what it would be, because the NPR will go out and interview some people, but it's like sending some correspondent to a foreign country. They're what an interesting people you are. That kind of an attitude, and I think that's not their idea. Well, it's naive and cliche, but you need dialogue amongst variety of people. And now NPR has gone for diversity as their big emphasis now, but it's only diversity for sort of what do they call them? There's subgroups in the society who have been excluded over the years, which would but does not include people who voted for Trump.
There's no ideological diversity. There's no ideological diversity.
No, absolutely no. Absolutely no ideological diversity. And what they are, I've said this to a couple of people, they don't like it, but they are allegedly going for a diverse audience by talking about these issues, but their audience becomes no more diverse. There are really no more Black people listening to NPR than there ever were, which is not very many, primarily because of education. But they're really satisfying the academic liberals who love diversity. So being diverse is actually appealing more to the core NPR audience. It's just kind of reinforcing that audience as opposed to actually diversifying the audience.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure that's why it came so quickly and so overwhelmingly. It was not resisted at all, that move, because of course we want that. That's what we do. That's what our sociology department is trying to become more diverse too.
Mm-hmm. But
not really.
Yeah.
Not
there's,
really.
Try to get a kind of neoconservative host on NPR.
Right. I think the greatest loss actually was Bill Buckley on PBS, because there was I was going to say intelligent, but that's probably true, but very articulate and persuasive and funny. He didn't take himself too seriously. He was kind of I enjoyed him, but he would, talk to John Kenneth Galbraith and other liberals, and they had good discussions, and or Gore Vidal, they were. Buckley was a great host for public broadcasting in talking to liberals, because he would challenge them, and quite effectively in many cases. And that's what they want. But there hasn't been anybody since.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I would love to have when I was we were trying to start up our talk service on WPR. Somebody recommended we hire this guy who had just been fired as a magazine editor in Milwaukee, and I said, no, I don't think so. We didn't even interview him. Turned out it was Charlie Sykes, who had went on to become, now he's a big, an intelligent conservative, and he was not when he got out to commercial radio in Milwaukee. He was just like Rush Limbaugh, bombastic, and that. But when he quit and started doing podcasts, and wrote several books about conservatism, he's extremely intelligent, so conservative, but very reasonable too. And I wish I'd hired him. Mm-hmm. But I didn't. I was running a public radio station. We don't do that. Mm-hmm. But we should have.
Yeah. So people who rely on NPR, New York Times, there's going to be some negative implications for a democracy, as you said, that doesn't have these other viewpoints aired in a fair way.
I think that's fair. I think it's true. Yeah. But I'm not sure if, say, NPR did that, they actually tried to do all that, would anybody listen? Okay, you'd make the liberals mad. Mm-hmm. Yeah, come on, used to be good. Used to be tell it straight ahead truth.
Right.
And would the conservatives trust enough to come over? I don't know. But I think you're right. That's basically what I'm saying, is we should have interaction.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think, so part of the argument that I'm going to try to be making in this article that I'm writing is that it's not even so much a left versus right, conservative versus liberal kind of framework. I think there's a lot of hunger in alternative media for not necessarily those specific left-right ideologies that aren't represented on NPR, but just a kind of less professionalized, more adversarial to power kind of coverage that isn't found on NPR.
Yeah, that's not sanitized, and it is not edited. It's not so put together. It's more evolves from what's going on. That's why I like the live call-in idea. because it's you really don't know what's going to happen. And but even that has to be controlled. You don't want a lot of people just calling in and insulting each other. You want intelligent discussion, or at least informed discussion, and trying to keep that from becoming just a bunch of name calling would be is important. But I think it can be done. But wish I could think of somebody who's actually doing it. The Canadians once, when I was putting together All Things Considered, but Bill Siemering sent me up to Canada for a week or so and to watch what CBC was doing, and they had a much more democratic kind of approach than NPR in those days, and that was still did. But they had, they used to play country music as breaks in their magazine shows, as opposed to the kind of stuff, new agey stuff that NPR does. Okay, well, they was trying to say this is a comfortable place for you folks out in Saskatchewan to listen. That was a little thing, but that impressed me that they were trying to be open to a variety of people. And I respect the CBC a lot. I think they're trying. Well, I respect them that way.
And there's a lot of talk of lack of trust in journalism these days, and people kind of having a very skeptical eye and turning away from a lot of the mainstream journalism. Do you think that is any way a product of the kind of professionalized tone?
Yeah, the tone turns off a lot of people. They use language that people don't necessarily understand or aren't comfortable with. It's not language they would use. The Linda Wertheimer approach. They don't even know they're doing it. It's just the way they talk. They think it's conversational, and it is for them. But the social divide is quite different. So that's a part of it. If you go back to Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, well, he had folks of all kinds of persuasions listening, but there was no choice. I mean, You had Cronkite or Huntley Brinkley, and it's the fact that our media is so splittered that I'm not sure there can be a place that everybody trusts or feels confident in, because they'll have lots of places that they can go to that they hear nothing that's going to be bothersome to them. Why make yourself uncomfortable when you can be in a comfortable place, be it Rush Limbaugh or NPR? Who wants to be uncomfortable?
Yeah.
Who wants to be questioned?
Well,
solve all your problems?
Yeah. Yeah, I think we figured it out. I think we're going to fix NPR.
Now I got to start a new one.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Mitchell, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sitting down.
Enjoyed it.
This was really helpful.
I can shoot off my mouth. You hear it. I don't know anybody else, but maybe you'll find a line or two you can use.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really appreciate your perspective. You bring a lot of institutional knowledge on this. So this was really helpful.
Yep. But not a prisoner of the institution.
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay. It's been fun. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you. Have a good one.
I will.
Bye-bye.